Night Bible Study. In this study, we're going to talk a little bit about the trustworthiness of the gospel accounts. We're going to talk about why we can trust the gospel's account of the resurrection of Jesus. This is actually a sermon that I preached a couple of years ago, but I think it's good if we revisit it because this is a question that a lot of people tend to have. How can I trust the New Testament authors? How can I trust that Jesus Christ really was risen from the dead? You know, this is the foundation of our faith. If Christ has not raised, why are we doing anything at all with regards to Christianity? And so that's what we're going to talk about in the Monday Night Bible Study today. We're going to revisit a sermon that I preached about 2 years ago on the case for the resurrection of Jesus. Here we go.
Well, good evening. As Aaron said this morning, both of us are preaching on the resurrection of Jesus today because much of the religious world, much of the Christian religious world are taking the time to focus on the resurrection of Jesus. And that makes sense. It makes sense that Christians are focusing on the resurrection of Jesus because as Aaron said in his lesson this morning, the resurrection really is the foundation of our faith. If Jesus has not been raised, then he is a liar. And our faith is in vain. And what are we even doing here? We're just wasting our time here right now. But if Jesus has been raised from the dead, then he is God. He is king. He has the words to eternal life. And so we need to follow him. You see, the resurrection is foundational to our faith. And I'm not going to take the time to re-preach that this evening. Aaron did a great job of that this morning. What I want to do this evening is I want to make the case for the resurrection of Jesus. We're going to talk about why we can be sure that Jesus did indeed rise from the dead. Essentially, I just want to give some evidence for the resurrection of Jesus this evening. Here's going to be the structure of the lesson. We're going to begin in the first half of the lesson talking about 4 historical facts. And these 4 things are things that are agreed upon by historical scholars who specialize in the New Testament, whether they're atheist or whether they're theist. These are things that are just widely agreed upon. Virtually every historical scholar, every New Testament scholar will agree with these 4 facts. So we're going to begin there. We're going to begin with 4 facts, 4 historical facts about the resurrection, and then we're going to talk about, okay, how do we explain these facts? How do we interpret these facts? And we'll go through a number of different scenarios. So let's go ahead and jump into the lesson and talk about these historical facts. The first is that Jesus died by crucifixion. Jesus died by crucifixion. And I think this is an important first point to make because there are some who don't believe in Jesus at all. There are some who say, well, Jesus is just this myth. He never really existed. He's a character in a fairy tale or a character in a fictional story. He didn't really exist. But there's not a single historical scholar who's worth his salt or her salt that agrees with this. Jesus existed, and that is made clear when looking through the historical record. As a matter of fact, I just want to take a look at some of the evidence for Jesus and his death by crucifixion. We're going to start with Josephus. Josephus was a Jewish historian who worked for the Roman government. So he wasn't a Christian historian. He wasn't really friendly to the Christians. He was a Jewish historian. And this is what he says about Jesus. He says, at this time, there was a wise man called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And so Josephus begins his historical record here in Antiquities of the Jews. He begins this section by saying, okay, well, Jesus did exist. He was a wise man. He was a virtuous and good man. And he goes on to say, many people among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. And Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. And so the fact that Jesus lived and died by crucifixion, it's supported by the historical record. It's a historical fact. And the people who deny that, they're just not well informed. Here, let's look at another historian named Tacitus. He was a Greek or a Roman historian. And this is what he says. He says, therefore, to scotch the rumor. What Tacitus is talking about, this rumor, there was a fire that went through the city of Rome. And there was this rumor that Nero, the emperor Nero, started the fire. And so all of the eyes were on Nero. And so Nero wanted to take all of the eyes that were on him and point them somewhere else. And so Tacitus tells us what Nero does. Therefore, to scotch the rumor, Nero substituted as culprits and punished with the utmost refinements of cruelty a class of men loathed for their vices, whom the crowd styled Christians. And so Tacitus tells us that Nero wanted to take the blame off of himself, and so he lies. He blames the Christians for the burning of Rome. And then he says, you know what, I'm going to persecute the Christians because they did this horrible thing that I lied about. It doesn't make sense. But Nero, who's a horrible person. He was a horrible person. He blames the Christians unjustly and then says, you know what, I'm going to punish them. But this is what he goes on to say about the leader of the Christians. Christus, the founder of the name, the founder of Christianity, he's talking about Jesus Christ. Christus, the founder of the name, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius. And so, again, we see another ancient historian confirming the death of Jesus by Pontius Pilate. As a matter of fact, that's what he says, by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilate. And so that's confirmed here by Tacitus. Let's look at another example. This is not a historian, but this is an ancient writer. He was an ancient satirist. I believe he was writing to his son. And he says, the Christians, you know, worship a man to this day, the distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. And so Lucian here says, well, there's this guy who founded Christianity and he died. And so throughout the historical record, we see Jesus lived and died by crucifixion. And so don't let anyone say, you know, Jesus, he's just this made-up person. He's just this myth who never existed. That is not supported by the evidence. As a matter of fact, Bart Ehrman is a historical New Testament scholar, but he's an atheist. He doesn't believe in the resurrection. As a matter of fact, he's done debates where he debates against Christians who, other New Testament scholars who do believe in the resurrection. So he's not friendly to the resurrection of the dead. But this is what Bart Ehrman says. He's talking about the mythicists, the people who believe that Jesus are just a myth. He says, what is driving the mythicist agenda? Why do they work so hard at showing that Jesus never really lived? And then in a different article, he says, these views, the mythicist views, these views are so extreme and so unconvincing to 99.99% of the real experts. And what Bart is saying, Bart Ehrman, one of the things we'll see as we're going through this lesson is Bart Ehrman agrees with the facts. He interprets the facts differently than we do, but he agrees with the four facts that we're going to talk about here in this lesson. And so he says Jesus lived, and Bart Ehrman believes that Jesus died by crucifixion. As a matter of fact, there's another atheist biblical scholar, a historical scholar. His name is Gerd Ludemann, and he says Jesus' death as consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. It's a fact. It's a historical fact. And scholars who are atheists and scholars who are Christians agree here. Jesus died by crucifixion. And so that's number one. That's number one. Jesus died by crucifixion. Number two, another historical fact that atheist scholars and theist scholars agree on is that the disciples believed that the risen Jesus appeared to them. And this is something that's well documented. It's documented by Josephus. We'll talk about that here shortly. But it's also documented in the Bible, right? And so I'm going to 1 Corinthians 15. 1 Corinthians 15, this is what Ross read for us earlier. Paul says, for I passed on to you as most important what I also received, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried and was raised on the third day. And then he appeared to all these people. He appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, and then he appeared to 500 people, and then James. But down here in verse 8, Paul says, last of all, as to one born at the wrong time, he also appeared to me. And so Paul says that the risen Jesus appeared to me. I saw him. And so here we see that the disciples believed, the early disciples believed that the risen Jesus appeared to them. But look, 1 Corinthians, the biblical authors aren't the only ones who admit this. Josephus admits this as well. We read from this earlier. So it talks about how Pilate condemned Jesus to be crucified, but those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and that he was alive. And so Josephus, the Jewish historian, says, the Christians are saying And Josephus lived around the time of the apostles, or during the time, that era of Christianity. Josephus says that those people are saying that Jesus appeared to them. And so it's a historical fact that the disciples believed that Jesus appeared to them. There's an early Christian named Clement of Rome, and he lived during the time of the apostles. As a matter of fact, this might be the same Clement that Paul mentions in Philippians chapter 4. That's just an interesting fact. It might not be, but it might be. And this is what he says about the apostles and the resurrection. He says, "And having been fully assured through the resurrection of our Lord Jesus, they went out with glad tidings, teaching that the kingdom of God should come." And so here, Clement, he's writing to the Corinthian church. This is about 95 AD when he writes to the Corinthian church. And he says that the apostles saw Jesus. And because of this, they were fully assured and were able to go out and teach the gospel. And so what we see from the historical record is that Jesus' disciples truly believed that he was raised from the dead and that he appeared to them. That's what Bart Ehrman says. Bart Ehrman says it's a historical fact. A historical fact. This is an atheist biblical scholar. It is a historical fact that some of Jesus' followers came to believe that he had been raised from the dead. And so that's number two. That's number two. The second historical fact that theist scholars and atheist scholars agree on is that the disciples believed that the risen Jesus had appeared to them. Number three, the resurrection was taught extremely early. And the reason why I bring that up is because some people say, and we'll come back to this a little bit later, but some people say the resurrection story really is just a legend. It's a legend that happened centuries after the actual events. You know how legends happen? Some people might say, actually, if you've ever heard this, if you've ever heard your grandparents say, I walked uphill in the snow both ways to school, right? Sort of that's how legends, but really what happened was their parents walked them 2 blocks to school. That's what really happened. But it became a legend, right? And so legends in the ancient world happen over centuries once the original audience has all died. But one of the historical facts that we see through the historical record is that the resurrection was taught extremely, extremely early. I mean, years after Jesus died. And we see that. The best evidence for this is in 1 Corinthians 15. We read this already. 1 Corinthians 15, picking up in verse 3, most scholars look at this and they'll say these words are not original to the Apostle Paul. As a matter of fact, that seems to be what Paul says. Paul says, I passed on to you what I received. And so Paul received something that he then went on and passed on to the Corinthian church. And so what most scholars will say about that passage is Paul is reciting like an early Christian motto or an early Christian creed. I know we don't like the word creed, but think of it sort of like a motto. This was an early Christian motto that was taught, it was memorized, and then it was passed on as sort of an evangelistic tool that Christians could memorize. And so that's what we see here from verse 3 down to essentially verse 7, this early Christian motto. And most scholars say that Paul received this from the apostles whenever he went to Jerusalem 3 years after his conversion. And so what they'll say, and what ultimately this means, is that the resurrection, this motto or this creed was being taught within 5 years of Jesus's death. As a matter of fact, that's what this biblical scholar says. This is a Christian biblical scholar. But when talking about 1 Corinthians 15, he says, when you survey the literature, scholars from all different backgrounds and faiths, or no faith, are virtually unanimous that this creedal tradition, 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 7, that this creedal tradition dates on average to within 5 years of Jesus' death. And so my point here is that the resurrection, we know the resurrection was being taught 50 days after Jesus' death just by looking at Acts and Pentecost. But from a skeptic mind, from an atheist mind, just looking at the historical record, we know that the resurrection was being taught 5 years after Jesus' death. This is no legend. This isn't something that was made up over centuries. This was being taught almost immediately after Jesus' death. As a matter of fact, Bart Ehrman goes on to say, this is sort of the same quote that we read from earlier. Bart Ehrman says, it's a historical fact that some of Jesus' followers came to believe that he had been raised from the dead soon after his resurrection. And so this wasn't something that took centuries where people were sort of crafting this story and making it bigger and bigger and bigger. Bart Ehrman, the atheist, says, no, this was being taught soon after Jesus' resurrection. And so that's number three. That's number three, the third historical fact that atheist scholars and theist scholars all agree with. Here's number four. Number four, the disciples were transformed by the resurrection, or by what they believed to be the resurrection. They believed that Jesus came, and the risen Jesus came and appeared to them, and they were transformed by that fact. As a matter of fact, when we look at the disciples after Jesus' death, what were they doing? It says, when it was evening on the first day of the week, the disciples gathered together. The doors were locked. Why? Because they were afraid, right? Because of fear. The Jews have already killed Jesus, and we're worried they might kill us. And so here we see that the disciples, they're afraid of persecution. They're afraid of going to jail. They're afraid of death. But how long did that last? When the risen Jesus appeared to them, there was a change. And whenever we get to the book of Acts, we see that the apostles or the disciples, they are rejoicing as they're being persecuted. They're rejoicing as they're being thrown in jail because they were able to suffer the same types of persecution that their Savior suffered. And so what prompted that change? Well, for them, their Lord and King defeated death. So they had nothing to worry about. That's what it says in Hebrews chapter 2. Hebrews chapter 2, Jesus shared in these so that through his death he might destroy the one holding the power of death and free those who were held in slavery all their lives by the fear of death. And so the disciples, they were transformed by the resurrection. Even the extra-biblical writers admit this. Ignatius admits this. Ignatius was an early Christian who, again, lived during the time of the apostles. And he talks about when Jesus appears to the apostles for the first time after his death and after his resurrection. Ignatius says, for when he came to those who were with Peter, he said to them, take hold on me and handle me and see that I am not a spirit without a body. And as soon as they touched him and felt his flesh and pulse, they believed. It is for this reason, because Jesus appeared to them raised, it is for this reason that they despised death and even showed themselves superior to death. And after his resurrection, he ate and drank with them like anyone else with a body. And so Ignatius here, he says, because the Lord appeared to them raised, they despise death. And that Greek word that Ignatius uses is the idea that you hold no regard for something. Death was not a big deal for them. Why? Because they believed they saw the risen Jesus who had defeated death. And so that's something we see in the historical record as well. The disciples, they were transformed by the resurrection. And that's true of Paul, by the way, and James. James the skeptic, we know from the Bible and from other sources that James was a devout Jew. Why did he change? Well, Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians 15, he saw the risen Jesus. And Paul, the persecutor, that's something that scholars from both sides accept. The atheist and the theist, the Christian scholars, they accept that Paul was changed. Why? What changed Paul's mind? Why did he go from being a persecutor of the church to a follower of Jesus? Paul tells us it's because he claimed to see the risen Jesus. And so these are the four historical facts. These are the four historical facts. It is a fact that Jesus died by crucifixion. It is a fact that the disciples believed that the risen Jesus appeared to them. It is a fact that the resurrection was taught extremely early. And it is a fact that the disciples were transformed by what they believed to be the resurrection. Let's talk for a little while about how we can explain the facts. How can we interpret these facts? I'll explain how some atheists and some critics, some critical scholars have explained this in the past. But for the most part, they've abandoned most of these. But I'll explain some of them. In the past, some critical scholars have said, well, it's just a legend. This is a legend that's popped up centuries after the original event. We've already talked about that. It wasn't a legend. This was being taught within 5 years of Jesus' death. So that explanation is out. We can go ahead and move past that one. Number two, this was fraud. And so some people will say either the disciples stole the body or someone else stole the body. And so the disciples crafted this story of Jesus being raised from the dead. What do you call that, by the way, when someone crafts a story that didn't happen? Yeah, we call that a lie, right? And so essentially what this theory, what this explanation says, is that the disciples lied. They're lying about seeing the risen Jesus. And that doesn't adequately explain the evidence either. It doesn't adequately explain the evidence, one, because it's a historical fact that the disciples believed that the risen Jesus appeared to them. And so scholars, for the most part, they don't hold to this fraud theory. The disciples really believed that Jesus appeared to them. But furthermore, they were transformed and lived different lives so much so that they were persecuted and killed for that belief. Peter, he was killed for saying, hey, I saw the risen Jesus. Paul was martyred for saying he saw the risen Jesus. James was martyred for saying he saw the risen Jesus. Well, who dies for what they know to be a lie? Anybody? No one dies for what they know to be a lie. Think about this. Why did the Watergate scandal come to light? Because someone didn't want to go to prison for a lie, right? If we're unwilling to go to prison for a lie, how much more are we unwilling to die for a lie? And so history tells us that people don't die for a lie. And so most scholars say, no, they weren't lying. They really believed that they had seen the risen Jesus. Here's another explanation that we've seen in the past. Jesus didn't really die on the cross. He didn't really die on the cross. Instead, he passed out on the cross, and he woke up 3 days later in the tomb. That doesn't fit the evidence either. I mean, from what we know about crucifixion, Bart mentioned some of this earlier, one of the biggest problems facing crucifixion victims was the problem of suffocation, asphyxiation. Because in order to breathe, in order to exhale, you had to lift yourself up in order to exhale. And lifting yourself up when you're on the cross would be very painful because you've got nails in your hands, you've got nails in your feet, and so you'd have to use your hands and your feet, which are nailed to the cross, to lift yourself up. And so eventually people would just get tired of the pain, they'd give up, and they would suffocate. And so my point in bringing all of that up is, if Jesus passed out on the cross, he would likely just die because he couldn't breathe. He would likely just suffocate on the cross. I think the thought that Jesus didn't die on the cross, instead he passed out with open wounds on his back, open wounds in his hands and in his legs, and they took him, put him in a cold tomb filled with bacteria, and he avoided infection, and he didn't have any medical help, and he just woke up one day and said, hey, I'm pretty good. I think that's pretty laughable. I think that's a pretty ridiculous theory, and scholars agree. Scholars on both sides of the aisle agree that that's pretty ridiculous. And so they would say, no, we believe Jesus really died on the cross. As a matter of fact, that's what every historical account says. Josephus, Tacitus, that's what the gospel accounts say. All of them say Jesus died on the cross. There's not a single shred of evidence that he didn't die. He passed out on the cross. And another reason that we've sort of heard in the past was the disciples, they had these hallucinations. They had these delusions where they had either visions or hallucinations of seeing the risen Jesus. But that doesn't really fit the evidence either. I mean, how many people claim to have seen the risen Jesus? Well, Peter did. Paul claimed to have seen the risen Jesus. We're told that James saw the risen Jesus. And so did all of these people have the same hallucination? Is that how hallucinations work? We all right now are just going to have the same hallucination? That's not how hallucinations work. And medical professionals know that, right? And so this theory was pretty short-lived, and no one really follows this. And so we've gone through these four pretty bad theories that try to explain the evidence, and they don't really work. And biblical and historical scholars know that they don't really work. And so what do the critical and atheist biblical scholars say today? This is what they say today. They say, something happened, but we don't know what it was. And we can't know what it was. They'll say, the disciples definitely experienced something, but what it was, we cannot know. I'll give you a couple of examples of this. Ed Sanders or E.P. Sanders, he says that Jesus' followers, and by the way, this is weird because Ed is a Christian biblical scholar, but he does not believe in the resurrection. And Aaron and I were talking about this, and yeah, it's like a fish not believing in water. But here, Ed Sanders says that Jesus' followers, and later Paul, had resurrection experiences is, in my judgment, a fact. And so he says that the disciples and Paul had resurrection experiences. That's a fact. But what the reality was that gave rise to these experiences, I do not know. And so, yeah, they had these resurrection experiences, but why that came about, I don't know. But it surely wasn't the resurrected Jesus, is what Ed would say. They had these experiences, but we don't really know what it is. Bart Ehrman, we've been messing around with this quote from Bart Ehrman for a while, but here's the whole context. Bart Ehrman, he says, it is a historical fact that some of Jesus' followers came to believe that he had been raised from the dead soon after his execution. We know some of these believers by name. One of them, the Apostle Paul, claims quite plainly to have seen Jesus alive after his death. Thus, for the historian, Christianity begins after the death of Jesus, not with the resurrection itself, but with the belief in the resurrection. And so Bart Ehrman believes that the disciples, yes, they came to believe in the resurrection. They had some sort of experience, but what was it? I don't know. It certainly wasn't the resurrection. That's what Bart Ehrman says. Essentially, what these scholars are saying is they know what the evidence points to. They know that none of the naturalistic explanations really work. And so we know that Jesus rising from the dead is probably the best explanation, but that can't happen. Resurrections don't happen. And since it can't be the resurrection, we just don't know what it is. That's essentially what they're saying. Let me give you the best explanation for this, at least in my opinion, my humble opinion. Jesus rose. Jesus rose. I think that's the best explanation for all of the evidence. I mean, why did the disciples believe that the risen Jesus appeared to them? Why did Paul say, I saw Jesus after his death? None of those other explanations that we went through really answers that. Maybe it's because Jesus rose. Why did Peter say, I saw the risen Jesus? Why are we told that James said he saw the risen Jesus? All these people say they saw Jesus alive after his death. Maybe it's because he actually rose. And let's continue that line of thought. Why were the disciples transformed to the point where they were even willing to die for that lie? Peter, James, and Paul all died for something they knew to be a lie. That's ridiculous. Because Jesus rose from the dead. All of those other theories are extremely weak, and I believe that the atheist scholars essentially admit this. Whenever they say, yeah, something happened, but we don't know what it is, essentially what they're saying is all the naturalistic theories don't really work. But it can't be the resurrection. It can't be a miracle. And so we just don't know what it is. The best explanation for the historical facts that we've laid out, the 4 historical facts, is that Jesus rose from the dead. And as I said in the introduction, if Jesus rose from the dead, that means he is Lord, he is King, and we must follow him. That's the lesson. Thank you for listening. Thank you for listening. Maybe there's someone here this evening who realizes that Jesus is Lord and King, and so you want to follow him. You want Jesus to rule in your life. We'd love to help you with that. If you need to respond to the invitation, you can come forward as we stand and as we sing.